Welcome everyone to the New South Wales Policy Professionals webinar series. We're in 2023, almost the end of 2023, which is our fourth year. And we're joined today by William Murphy from the Cabinet Office. And before we get started, I'll acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all on today and recognise this land as Aboriginal land. William was appointed Acting Secretary of the Cabinet Office in September 2023, and prior to this was also the Deputy Secretaries ×2 for Social Policy, National Reform and Economic and Environmental Policy. So he must have been very busy during that time, holding down all of those portfolio areas. We'll be talking today about the role of the Cabinet Office and the role of Cabinet in the New South Wales Government. So we're really excited to hear from you and find out all the latest from the Cabinet Office there. But we acknowledge that you have a tremendous wealth of experience in policy in New South Wales, and prior to joining the Cabinet Office, you were pivotal in the establishment of the Department of Customer Service, leading customer delivery and transformation, and where you drove customer centricity in data-led decision-making and service design, including the introduction of the New South Wales State of the Customer Report and modernising the operations of the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and overseeing the whole of government communications and branding. And you've also worked in the Premier's implementation unit, leading the government's focus on transformation to digital, better use of data and driving better outcomes for the people of New South Wales. And looks like I've got a good competition on my hand for the most degrees ever, with your being a graduate of the Executive Fellows and Executive Master of Public Administration from ANZOG and the University of Sydney, and you also hold a Masters of Management Industry Strategy from the ANU and a Bachelor of Commerce, Economics and Finance from Curtin University, and you've recently been recognised with the Public Service Medal. William, I'll hand over to you now. We'll be having I don't know whether it's a presentation or I think a run through perhaps, William, of all the things that have been going on in the Cabinet Office recently, and there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. So I'll put a message in the chat for our audience on how to participate in that. But until we get to that stage, I just ask if you can keep your cameras off so we can all focus our attention on William. I'll hand over to you now. Thanks.
Thanks, Louisa, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to talk to you. Did I just see Paul McCarthy on the line? It's great to see so many familiar faces on this call, people I've interacted with over the years, but the way you gave me that introduction makes me feel really old, so thanks for that, Louisa. But yes, I have worked in a number of policy roles, well, a lot of policy roles really across state and federal government, but one role that I am thinking a lot about these days is that when I started my public service career in New South Wales, I started in the Cabinet Office back when we had a Cabinet Office before, and it's very exciting to be back here as part of re-establishing the Cabinet Office in New South Wales. But look, I might just, and I know this might be sort of very familiar content to some of you, but some of you it might be new, is really just going back over what the Cabinet is and the role that the Cabinet plays, which is really important sort of foundational piece for then thinking about what the Cabinet Office does and how we all work together across government on this. So, as you know, under the sort of the Westminster traditions of government, there is a Premier who leads the government in Parliament, and the Premier appoints ministers to ministerial portfolios. Now, those are formal roles that are appointed properly. They're appointed by the Governor, but you know, on the Premier's advice, and that appointment gives those ministers essentially the authority to govern. A lot of legislation in New South Wales gives powers to ministers to make decisions and to do things. That's where that comes from. But even though each minister has a separate or mostly have separate portfolios, so there's a minister for transport, there's a minister for health, there's a minister for education. That's a really that's a traditional part of the Westminster system. Another really important traditional part of the system is that they operate as one government. They have collective responsibility for the decisions that they make as government. And that's where the cabinet comes in. Now, I've worked with a lot of people in government over the years who come from a lot of different backgrounds. And sometimes, what I've seen is people who might come into government roles, at senior levels who've come in from a non-government background, a commercial background, say. They bring a lot of great skills and a lot of different perspectives to the work of government. But one of the things that they first have to get used to when they join government is to appreciate that the minister is not their boss. That's not how this relationship works under the system that we operate in. The public service is very separate to executive government. You could think of the minister more like your customer than your boss. But similarly, there's a bit of a sometimes a bit of a misalignment in understanding, where some people see the cabinet as being like a board. It's not. It's a collective decision-making body of peers. So the principles underpinning that approach, the first principle that's really important is the principle of collective responsibility. So the cabinet might have a debate amongst themselves about a particular policy decision, but once they've taken that decision, it's recorded collectively as a decision of the cabinet. There is no recording of, who was for it, who wasn't for it. Those decisions are, the cabinet as a collective group is held to account for those decisions. And for that reason, only ministers are members of the cabinet. So any decision that comes to cabinet for discussion is brought to cabinet by a minister. So departments don't get to send decisions to cabinet. Only ministers bring them to cabinet. That's a really important distinction that a lot of people can get confused about. The second really important characteristic of cabinet government is the principle of cabinet confidentiality. If the cabinet is going to take collective responsibility for its decisions, it's really important that the discussions that go on in forming that decision are confidential. Otherwise, you can end up with this situation where there's a kind of a public discourse about how this minister didn't support it and that minister didn't support it. That undermines that principle of collective responsibility. So confidentiality of cabinet material is really a critical part of maintaining that principle. And the third one, which is sometimes referred to as a core principle of cabinet process, I think it is the principle that ministers don't preempt cabinet decisions. So a minister doesn't go and announce a policy position and say, this is the policy position the government's going to take, I'm taking it to cabinet next week. Until it's actually been to cabinet, it's not a government, decision. They don't have that coverage of that collective responsibility. So this group that meets on a regular basis, the cabinet, that is why we have a cabinet office. The role of the cabinet office is to support that group in their collective consideration and decision making. A lot of people then, I think, make I've seen this. People get the wrong impression of this. They seem to think that the cabinet decision itself is the critical part of the process. To me, the really critical part of the process is the couple of weeks leading up to the cabinet decision. Because what's important is that if ministers are going to make a decision in the room, they need to be able to discuss, the policy merits, alignment to their, political platform, rather than be debating whether the numbers are right, whether the analysis is complete, whether the facts about X, Y, Z are accurate in the submission documents. It's really important that in the lead up to the cabinet process, agencies have time to have a look at those proposals, provide advice, make sure the analysis is complete, make sure the analysis is accurate, make sure all the perspectives are there and properly represented, so that when that document turns up on the cabinet table, the ministers are really well informed. Because a critical part of the Premier's logic when he re-established the cabinet office in New South Wales is to make sure that cabinet makes well-informed decisions. So, and that is where you all come in. You all have a really important role to play in the cabinet process in making sure that those decisions are, well informed, so they are well made on the basis of, good evidence. Now that doesn't mean that cabinet decisions are, technocratic decisions. It doesn't mean that we've put the data into the machine and the machine says the answer is X and that's what the government should do. Because a really important part of our political system is that those members of cabinet, those members of parliament, are elected to represent the population on the basis of the values that they espouse in the lead up to the election. And so with all of these things, having the evidence, the analysis, the data correct, then gives the cabinet a chance to discuss how that fits in with the promises they made to the electorate before they came into government. And so that layer of decision making is a really important part of getting the right outcome from our democratic process. I know these all sound like pretty big, lofty concepts, but to me, they're the day-to-day existence of the people who work in the Cabinet Office. So what do we do here? So the Cabinet Office has a few functions. Firstly, obviously, we have that really basic fundamental role in making sure that that cabinet process works well. So that's the kind of cabinet secretariat function. As you know, we have a two-stage process in theory in New South Wales, and the role of the cabinet team is to make sure that that process runs, the documents are shared, the meetings are organised, the decisions are recorded, all of that sort of element of the cabinet process. The second thing the Cabinet Office does is we provide sort of what you might call sort of independent policy advice to the Premier and to the Cabinet on proposals. So one way of looking at the Cabinet process is to say it might be a sort of a contest of ideas sometimes between different portfolios. There's always it's very rare that a decision about a course of action for government only impacts that particular portfolio. Decisions that impact the people of New South Wales tend to impact them in multiple ways. And so if there's a sort of a contest of ideas between different portfolios, the role of the Cabinet Office there is to provide some kind of objective advice over the top that says, here's how this matter might, align to your previous decisions. Here's how it might align to national agreements that the state might be beholden to, or international agreements. There's a range of perspectives that Cabinet Office might bring to that policy advice that goes to the Premier. And in some cases, in some committees, it goes to all members of the committee, really, providing a sort of an objective overlay on top of the submissions themselves. What that does is it puts the Cabinet Office into a sort of a unique position in government where we have a good visibility of the government's agenda and what the government is seeking to achieve and the way that the government approaches particular decisions. But we also have good visibility of what's happening across the sector in terms of agencies. Where are the priorities? Where are the pressures? Where are the pain points? And we can use that role to play a sort of convening role between portfolios. So where there's a matter that's going to come to Cabinet later in the year and it is going to require trade-offs across multiple portfolios, Cabinet Office can play a really important role in bringing those agencies together around the table early and saying, look, here's where we need to get to. Let's work through some of the detail of these trade-offs so that what we can put in front of the Cabinet is a well thought through analysis of how a proposal lines up to their agenda, but also where are the trade-offs between different portfolios that they need to consider and what are some options for helping manage that. So, we can play that role across departments and across portfolios in a way that maybe, hasn't been done since we last had a Cabinet Office in New South Wales. I think the Department of Premier and Cabinet probably played that similar role for a while. But then the cluster arrangements probably change that dynamic a bit. With the cluster arrangements now defunct, back to sort of departments, there's a really important role there for how we can bring the sector together. The other thing that this unique position that Cabinet Office is in gives us the capacity to do is to work with agencies to see how we can collectively drive this government's priorities. So I'm sure you've all seen how much this government is committed to housing. Housing across New South Wales in an effort to make it more affordable. So with a big focus on housing, immediately you sort of think, well, we need to make sure that we've got, good alignment to a common end point here, a common goal across, planning, transport, water, health infrastructure, schools infrastructure, a whole range of portfolios. And of course, working really closely with our colleagues in the Treasury, making sure that the efforts of all those agencies are, really well aligned around delivering this government's priority around housing. There's a range of different policy areas where Cabinet Office can play that role. And the way I see the role that we play there is, firstly, of course, helping the government achieve its agenda, but also really helping agencies be successful in their agendas. Because, if you're transport, you've got priorities you need to deliver in terms of moving people around the city, setting that agenda up for success by making sure that it's, really nicely aligned with the housing agenda and other infrastructure, is part of everybody achieving their goals under this, under our kind of outcomes framework, which with the change of government is also likely to change pretty soon, under review at the moment. So that's a really important role, I think, that Cabinet Office and Treasury particularly working together can work across government to help, drive the government's priorities. At this point, Louisa, there's been a few hands go up. There's been a few questions in the chat. Should we?
No, I think just keep going, and we'll come back for questions.
Okay.
Yeah, in a few, maybe at about 10:30, or if you're happy to keep going.
Yeah. Okay, good. I think the other thing that I often get asked about in this role from people is, how should we approach providing policy advice in a way that is most useful? We see a lot of policy advice come up from agencies here and have that kind of helicopter view of that. And I guess one of the things that we really strive to do for the government, it's something I think is just good practice in policy advising, really, is to remember, I guess, that ministers are busy people. They've got a lot on their plate. Just any of you have a think about the multiple portfolios that your minister is accountable for. You can imagine how much material they need to get through in a week. So a really important characteristic, I think, of sort of quality policy advising in this context is really to be succinct. The quicker you can hit the target in terms of your policy advice, the more useful it will be. And the really hard part about that for policy advisors, I think, is that in getting across your areas of policy interest and in providing, high quality advice, you will need to be across a layer of complexity that, few people, would get across. There's always intersections with policy areas, with other legal frameworks, with other parts of government, with other levels of government. And, your role in understanding all of that complexity and being able to boil that down to some succinct advice is really important. So I think always remembering that you will know more about this than pretty much anybody else. You need to use your powers for good and understand that complexity, navigate that complexity, but try and bring that down to some really key, succinct pieces of advice that you can pass on to help people understand where this policy issue sits in that broader landscape, but also understand clearly what their options are for resolving it. I think the other question that I get asked about quite a bit is about the concept of frank and fearless advice. You know, what does that mean in our Westminster system these days? And that concept is, I think some people would argue that concept has morphed and changed over the years. Other people would argue that concept has stayed exactly the same, but just looks different how it lands in different contexts. I always try and think about the idea of frank and fearless as a really important part of our public sector value of integrity and accountability. We need to be frank in our policy advising. And when you use the word fearless, really it's about being, complete in your policy advice, making sure that anything that the decision maker needs to know about, that they are advised of. You want to make sure that they've got a full landscape of an issue before they make a decision. But at the same time, it's really important that our policy advice is kind of mindful of the context. Understanding that ministers have been elected on a particular platform, so they've taken a pitch to the community to say this is how we see the world and how we will seek to govern, and making sure that our policy advice is alive to that dimension. Doesn't mean modifying it to suit a particular position. It just means making sure that it's as useful as possible in the process that our elected representatives are making decisions. That's a sort of a short version of something that I know comes up a lot in people talking about how we provide useful policy advice. And I think that's something that we could probably talk about a bit more if you think that's useful, Louisa.
I'm sure we'll get questions on it.
But look, there's a bit of an overview. That's, I think, what an introduction, I guess, to what I think the new Cabinet Office or the reinstatement of the Cabinet Office means for New South Wales Government. And I'm really keen to hear your take on it. This group is a really important group to the Cabinet Office, so really keen to hear your take on it, what you think about it, and what you think we can do to help you in your roles.
Great. I'm just going to put some notes in the chat for people who would like to ask questions. I will ask you to write your question in the chat, and then I'll coordinate those questions to William. When it's your turn to ask a question, please turn your camera on and your microphone so we can hear you, and ask your question. But yeah, we'll proceed that way while you're thinking of your questions, and I'm sure you've got lots of them. William, I might ask you about, you've mentioned Treasury, but I guess the Premier's Department is another central agency that's new, and how you're working with the Premier's Department as well as it sets up its role in the future too.
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, I think when they were talking about how they would separate the Cabinet Office from the Premier's Department, there was a sort of a model that was used as a bit of a framing for that discussion, which was that there's sort of a continuum of activities here between sort of government strategy and policy flowing through to implementation and delivery. And if you consider that as a sort of a spectrum of activities, it's like the Cabinet Office has accountability in the sort of strategy and policy end, where then there's sort of a handover, if you like, into the implementation and delivery end. The Premier's Department, mostly sort of concerns itself there with that part. Now, when I say mostly, there are still some policy functions that sit within the Premier's Department. And so we work very closely to make sure that those policy functions are appropriately represented in the Cabinet process as well. But there's a lot of more sort of delivery-oriented functions in the Premier's Department. And of course, the Premier's Department and the Secretary of the Premier's Department has that role as the kind of head of the public sector. So you might have seen, I think it was last week, that Simon Draper, who's the head of the Premier's Department, did the State of the Sector address, talking about sort of where the sector is at, at the moment, and some of the key issues that it's facing. That's a really important role for Premier's Department to play. And I think, that flows through into a range of other kind of operational things that the Premier's Department does around industrial arrangements for public servants around emergency management coordination and other kind of things like that. When I get asked about, what's the logic of having a separate secretary of the Cabinet Office from the Premier's Department? We did all this with one before. And my take on this is that, the strategy and the policy agenda is kind of, it rolls on day after day. It's an enduring focus. Governments get elected for 4 years. They've got a platform that they want to deliver and a strategy they want to deliver. And so we work on that. The Cabinet Office Secretary is pretty busy doing that, and with the separation from Premier's Department, when there's, bushfires and floods and, protests and other things that impact multiple agencies that need senior level steering and leadership from the Premier's Department, that's what the Secretary of the Premier's Department leads. And that means that the Cabinet Office function is not sort of distracted by that day to day, but, keeps on that focus around, delivering, helping deliver the government's agenda. I think that's quite a neat approach. I'm not to say that there's a right model and a wrong model here. There's just different models of the way that you manage these things, and this is the model that's in place here in New South Wales now. And I think it's a bit of a virtue of the model, particularly as with climate change and other things happening, increasing regularity and severity of natural disasters and things. That role is probably going to become more and more important into the future. So I think that separation, works pretty well.
Yeah, I think it's good to recognise, and something I think that had been lost over time with the former arrangement.
Yeah.
We next have a question from Andrew. Andrew, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, William. Thanks for that. Just wanted to know if you can give some guidance on the thresholds for a decision needing to come to Cabinet versus a ministerial decision or a secretary's decision.
Yeah, great question. There are, of course, legal frameworks that govern this. So there are, there is legislation that puts decisions in the hands of ministers. And so that then defines, what is within the authority of a minister to determine on the, off their own advice. Sometimes those decisions are delegated to secretaries, and there's formal documentation around that. The cabinet process obviously is a set of conventions. It's not a formal process. It's not a legal process. It's a convention of the way that Westminster government has worked over centuries, and so there's no formal rules about that. What there is a cabinet handbook. There's a cabinet manual which you can find online, and in there you'll see a list of dot points which says these are the sorts of things which should come to cabinet, and it talks about things like major policy decisions, major sort of intergovernmental agreements, those sort of things. That list is not exhaustive, and it also doesn't preclude a minister who, even though they might have, legal authority to make a decision on their own, it might still be valuable to that minister to get a collective discussion with their colleagues, before they make that decision. So that's a tricky one sometimes for people who see the fact that cabinet is a convention, only see it as having kind of lesser standing maybe, or less significance than legal frameworks. And while there's a whole frame in which that could be right, it is such an important tenet of Westminster government. It's been held as a foundational institution of the way that government works. And so don't test me on what's in the list, but you can find that list in the cabinet handbook, and it's a pretty useful list, and it's referenced pretty regularly by people. It also changes every now and again, with things that are added in response to a particular event that occurs or a decision that comes up that people hadn't thought about the significance of this decision, and maybe it is a one of those that government wants to take collective responsibility for. And so it's always in the power of ministers to bring those things. One thing I would say, though, about the idea of decisions coming to Cabinet, sometimes there are things that come to Cabinet for noting. Now, on occasion, it might be Cabinet, it might be a subcommittee of Cabinet. On occasion, there are significant things that it is important for the members of Cabinet to note, and to note it in a way that benefits from the Cabinet confidentiality arrangements. But on the whole, what we try and do is make sure that matters come to Cabinet when they do require a decision, so that there's an action people take. There's a real reason for them to come to Cabinet, and as part of that, it'd be good to keep the number of noting recommendations to a minimum. I talk to a lot of ministers about their experience of dealing with Cabinet and dealing with Cabinet submissions, and it won't surprise you to know that to prepare for Cabinet, a minister needs to read a big, thick folder of documents on occasion, and it's easier for them when the recommendations of a Cabinet submission really quickly get to what we are asking you to approve. Sometimes you'll see a page or more of note this thing we did before, note this other wonderful thing that we're working on, note how good we are. And then it sort of gets down the second page to, approve this thing. And it's like, whoa, wasn't ready for that. So that's a bit of a tip on Cabinet drafting, I guess. Try and keep the noting recs to a minimum.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll make sure to look up that Cabinet manual.
Yeah, check it out. You should be able to find it online. If you can't, we can send through
I think
a link to people.
Someone has popped a link in the chat, so thank you very much.
Nice.
And we now have an unknown user ask, who will hopefully pop on and ask their question. It's about confidentiality in the Cabinet process.
Oh, okay.
If that person is unsure,
I will ask. Is this the question here about Cabinet confidentiality and New Zealand?
No, I'll ask the question on their behalf.
Okay.
So they ask, Cabinet documents and discussions. Well, they say Cabinet documents and discussions shouldn't be secret. Maybe it's idealistic, but the ministers are there to represent the people, and there should be a greater level of transparency so that ministers can be held accountable for their discussions and decisions. William, do you have any thoughts on that? Is there and New Zealand, I think, is an example where they release their Cabinet decisions after 4 weeks.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. And Cabinet documents are released to the public eventually. In New South Wales, it's after 20 years. In other jurisdictions, it's 30 years, or some of them might be shorter. I know that in New Zealand there is a practice of publishing Cabinet submissions online. I think a very short period after the Cabinet deliberations, and in Queensland, I think they've recently announced an intention to publish them within 30 days, although I'm not sure what that will really mean. I guess it's a complex issue, but I guess the first thing I'd say on that question is ministers aren't appointed by the people. Ministers are appointed by the Premier. And so this idea of ministers being held to account in their portfolio, it is a matter for the government to be held to account rather than an individual elected representative. We elect representatives on the basis of a geographical location. So people in an area vote for a person to represent them. If that person then becomes a minister, that person's ministerial accountability is for the whole state, not just for people in their elected area. So there's a bit of a disconnect there between the role of ministers and representation of the people who voted for them, which the Cabinet collective responsibility sort of helps manage that. When you say they shouldn't be secret, it's a trade-off. I think we want, in jurisdictions where they publish Cabinet documents, there's some people might say there's a risk that in the interests of in knowing that those documents are going to be public, maybe those documents are prepared in a way that they're not as fully frank as they could be if they weren't going to be made public, if you know what I mean. There's a real emphasis here on making sure that decisions are made based on full and frank advice. And there's been a view that if that information is to be full and frank, then that is assisted by understanding that those documents are then kept tight for a period of time after the decision. It's a it's a view taken by some, maybe others don't agree. In New South Wales, the practice is that cabinet documents are held confidential for a period of time after cabinet deliberations, which you know provides an environment in which full and frank advice can be provided to cabinet to support effective decision making. I guess that's the view that's taken. That other jurisdictions are moving to take a different view, Sonia, as you say. So it'll be interesting to see where this all lands.
Yeah. I've got a follow-on question as well from another about audience member, which I think we should ask you now about. So, and this concerns the distribution of cabinet decisions and on the concerns about cabinet in confidence mean those decisions are often held very tightly, which can mean in some situations that people working to implement the cabinet decisions do not actually understand the decision that has been made. Is there guidance on how far can we go in terms of distributing cabinet decisions to those involved in their implementation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of a technical answer to that question, but I guess the principled answer is if you're going to be expected to implement a decision of cabinet, then at some level in your organisation you need to have clarity about what that was. So if that's not happening, let us know. We'll have to make sure we put a process in place to ensure that happens. But I think mostly that seems to work okay. But if people have got a situation where they're not able to understand what the decision was, let us know and we'll make sure we can sort that out.
Yeah, and I think the Cabinet Office policy staff are always a good source of advice on that as well. So
yeah, if you don't know who your Cabinet Office policy contacts are, you should find out.
Yes.
That's a useful phone number to have.
Yes, definitely. Okay, our next question, still on the cabinet theme, is from Karen Deep in Transport.
Hi, Will. Karen Deep in Transport. I just wanted to ask, how do you think the structure or this model will play out when there are different perspectives or conflicts with ministers? I was thinking about the koala policy that we had with Barilaro previously. So will I guess the minister's office may have a different perspective. I guess how will the Cabinet Office, broker an agreement in that space?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's not just in the kind of in that area where this question pops up. And I think that's actually quite a valuable role that Cabinet Office can play is in bringing agencies together to say, look, here's the sort of the government's intention. Here's what the government's committed to do, or what the government's seeking to achieve. How do we work together across different agencies with different perspectives on implementing that? And there's always going to be, trade-offs and compromises, if you like, in some of those complex policy areas. Costs that benefits that land here and costs that land over there, and so working that through and making sure that when the final set of proposals goes to cabinet for decision, that's been objectively really worked through what all of those trade-offs and consequences are, and that cabinet is fully informed of those and their relative costs and benefits in making their decision. That's where their role as representing the people of New South Wales really comes into the fore, is in those complex trade-offs between policy areas where there is a value judgment to be made there, and that's what they've been elected to do. It's not for public servants to make those value judgments. No one voted for us. That's what they are there to do. But the role that we play in that is to make sure that analysis is objective, it's evidence-based, and that the presentation of that data to cabinet to make that decision is really clear and complete, so that we're not seeking to be advocates for one particular outcome over another. That's their decision to make. It's really about making sure they've got the right information in front of them to make a fully informed and quality decision. I think in the interest of that, the sooner that agencies can get together with the support of the Cabinet Office, if that's helpful, the better, because sometimes these things do take time to work through, and sometimes government is in a position where it needs to make decisions, on a schedule, and you want to make sure that those decisions are being made in an environment of really good, sound, objective advice. Call us sooner rather than later, Karandeep. That'd be good.
And we're going to, I'm just changing the order up a bit, but Heidi, would you like to come on and ask your question, because it relates to this about the two-stage cabinet process?
Yeah, thanks, Louisa. Hi, William. Thanks for the presentation. You mentioned that there's a two-stage process for review of cabinet submissions. I think you said in theory, and maybe a few of us have experienced when that doesn't occur in practice.
Yeah.
I was wondering, with the re-establishment of the Cabinet Office, if there would be any sort of, would you be looking to enforce sort of stricter adherence to those processes and timeframes going forward?
Yeah, absolutely, Heidi. And look, and for a couple of reasons, the first one obviously is the two-stage process, which involves, for those who haven't seen it yet, which involves, of course, a draft submission being circulated to relevant ministers and agencies for advice, for comment. That has a sufficient amount of time for people to get across it and provide input. That advice then comes in, is collected and provided back to the initiating minister to respond to, and it might take the form of updates, amendments, changes to the draft submission to make it more complete or more accurate or reflect that feedback. In other cases, it might be, well, this is the feedback, but here's our response to it. That information is a really important part of when that decision is ultimately made, that decision is made on a fully objective, analysis. And so I think that two-stage process is a really important part of making quality decisions. Now, the two-stage process is also just in a practical sense, it just helps us all manage our day-to-day workflow and put our efforts where the priorities are, rather than being pushed around by deadlines. That's really important too. And it's equally important to just the well-being of our staff in having the time to think through and do a quality job, because everyone wants to feel like they've got the time to do their job as well as they can do it. So it's a really important part of it. And I've been talking to, ministers and the officers about it. I think there's an appreciation of the value of it and the need to really enforce that process. I think in practical terms, when you have a change of government, you have a new government comes in, they come in right at the start of a parliamentary session. They've got to get a whole program of legislation up. They've got a big budget task to work through, although they do get a bit of leeway with that first budget, pushing that out in September. In this case, there's still a lot to work through for a new government to really get under the budget and how to realign that to their priorities. There's a lot to do in a really short space of time, and that does put pressure on the timeframes around the cabinet process. My hope with the support of all of you as the policy community in New South Wales is that with that process now behind us, we can start to get a bit more strategic about the forward management of the cabinet agenda, and people be, much clearer upfront about, when the expectation is that their submissions will go to cabinet, so we can work back from there and make sure those timelines are worked to. Still a bit of, culture change and other things to work through in achieving that, Heidi, but I'm putting you in the list of people who are in support of doing that. So good to get your help to do it. And
I just wanted to say good luck, all the best, and I'm sure that there's many people on the call who are fully behind you.
Look, I'm sure you are, but you can always remind your own ministerial officers of the importance of the two-stage process, and we'll work at it from both ends. How about that?
We'll all do our best. Two-pronged approach. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that Denise is also sharing that view of how challenging it is to stick to those really clear timeframes but so important to do. So the objective is very sound. Now, we've got another question that Anthea might come on and ask about in terms of industry's input into cabinet decision making. Hi.
Yeah, thanks, Louisa, and thanks very much, William, for your presentation today. It's been very valuable. I agree with Heidi's sentiment as well, so we've worked with you from both ends there as well. Yeah, often we need to do industry or public consultation on a matter that will go into a cabinet decision. And so it's often really tricky, that best way to try and navigate managing those consultations on material that could be used as part of a cabinet decision. So have you got any advice around how we can get that balance right and make sure that we preserve the confidentiality of cabinet?
Yeah, look, I think what's important, I think, is a practice that is maybe not adhered to as much these days as it used to be, but it's kind of like, the first rule of cabinet is we don't talk about cabinet. Like, I sometimes see, letters people are writing to other people saying, cabinet considered this or approved this. And look, the principle of cabinet confidentiality is not just that the material that goes to cabinet is confidential, but cabinet decisions are confidential on a need-to-know basis, obviously for those who need to implement them, but also the dates of cabinet meetings, the people who are in attendance at cabinet meetings, the subcommittees of cabinet, all of that is confidential, because as soon as you start pulling on that thread, you start to unpick the confidentiality of the cabinet process. So my advice is, when you're engaging with industry bodies, the word cabinet doesn't need to come up. I mean, I just refer to, the government, is keen to make a decision on this matter. And, you might even provide broad timeframes to say, we understand the government's keen to make a decision on this before the end of the year, or if you need to, if there's some urgency. Talking about, we are trying to understand what the options are for dealing with this, so we can provide some advice. What are your thoughts on that? Having that conversation without sort of alluding to things that might or might not be considered by cabinet is a good place to start in sort of managing that. But I think agencies in interaction with industry is a really, really important part of the cabinet process, because being able to reflect in the material that goes to cabinet, here's what the key sort of industry players' perspectives are on this, is a really useful input. So I in no way would I be suggesting that you don't do that sort of engagement, but just that when you're doing it, you're just mindful not to kind of allude to what the dimensions of the cabinet decision might be. It's not a secret that a good policy process has a number of key steps to it. Identifying the problem you're trying to address, identifying what the options are for dealing with that problem, identifying what the costs and benefits of all of those options are. That's not a secret. And, the more we can engage stakeholders who are going to be impacted by these decisions in helping us articulate, the nature of the problem, what the options are, what the impacts of the different options are, the better decision making we'll get. So I think it's more an issue of, framing than it is a matter of sort of cabinet confidentiality.
Thanks, William.
Oscar, would you like to come on and ask your question? And I note that the context of this, I guess, is quite a challenging cabinet agenda, and the volume of materials that the ministers need to get across and cabinet needs to schedule and consider. Oscar.
Yeah, hey, sorry, my internet just dropped out. Hi, William, thanks for coming along.
Okay.
So I know from working in the cabinet space that there is such a lot of submissions that go to cabinet, some of them quite niche. And on top of that, the TCO is coordinating a lot of responses to inquiries and dealing with intergovernmental matters and doing other reviews. So that's a lot of work. And I was just wondering how what's the need there in terms of resourcing and capability in order to provide advice in such a wide range of matters across such a high volume of submissions? How how do the teams do it? Is it a matter of prioritization? You only focus on ones where you can do the value add, or do you try your best to cover all the ground? So yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, Oscar, and I could probably spend an afternoon going through with you on how I approach it. But one of the things that is really good about the Cabinet Office, I feel like it's a real privilege to be in this role, is that it is such a good team of really experienced people who are used to this, working in this kind of, it's a high volume and a high pace kind of environment. And it's true, you do tend to focus your energies where they're most productive. And so there are, not to say that any cabinet decisions are sort of more important than any others, but there's certainly are some that are more resource intensive than others. And so there are some things that are relatively straightforward. The analysis is clear, the data is clear, the alignment to the government's priority is clear, and we get a sense from the circulation that agencies are on board, talking to ministers and ministers' offices, that there's comfort with the direction. And so those things probably need a little bit less prioritization than where you've got a matter, like the sort of things that others have referred to in this discussion already, where there is a real trade-off between portfolios that needs to be worked through, and that does tend to take up a bit more time of Cabinet Office staff. It's one of those things where you're constantly reassessing priorities and adjusting on the fly. But we're all conscious of the importance of the role that we play, the part of the process that we administer, and making sure that we do that well. And so it's a constant process of prioritizing. But one of the good things, it's also a double-edged sword, I guess, but under this government, the Cabinet Office does get involved in every submission that goes to Cabinet, and not just to Cabinet, but to any of its subcommittees. And that is a big volume of work. Luckily, there's not a lot of subcommittees, so that's good. Try to keep that the case would be great. But it is a lot of work, but it also plays that role of giving Cabinet Office team like a really good helicopter view of the landscape of what is happening across government and how it's lining up to the government's agenda, which helps us add more value as we work through bringing agencies together and other things. So it's an important part of the process.
Yeah, they do a great job of being across it.
Thank you. I'll pass that on. They're a good team.
Thanks. And Alex, speaking of building capacity.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Just a broader question about building kind of policy capability in government. Feels like there might be a bit of opportunity with TCO being stood up again. If we, see your role and that agency as a kind of custodian of good policy making, just about whether there's more we could possibly do to really professionalise the policy profession, thinking in terms of training, guidance, standards, to kind of move on a bit from what the former head of the UK Civil Service referred to as the cult of the gifted amateur.
Yeah, I like that. Absolutely. And Louise has already raised that with me in a previous conversation about whether we can work together on doing just that. So really happy to work together on that. I think that's a fantastic opportunity. And the other thing I think is, having a Cabinet Office is a great opportunity for policy people to see the policy process from the other side. So I think, how we can work through a process of people coming and spending some time in Cabinet Office, some either secondments or, mobility arrangements or whatever it is, because, the more we can collectively experience all ends of this process that we support the government in, which is critical to effective, and accountable government. The more we can all experience all the ends of this, the better we'll be as a sector. So I think working out some ways that we can, make the Cabinet Office a bit of a journey on people's policy development, capability path would be great to do. I know when I was in the Cabinet Office many years ago, there was a reasonably high turnover of staff, and it was for that purpose. People would come in from agencies. They'd bring in their agency expertise to the process, but then in being in here, they would get that helicopter view of the whole sector and how the process worked really effectively from this end, and then go back to their agency or even to another agency, taking that experience and that skill set with them. And I've worked as a policy person in central agencies a few times before. I've also been a policy person in line agencies, and sometimes line agencies with a lot of profile and sometimes not. And it's a really different experience everywhere you work in policy. And I think the more that all of us can get that broad range of policy experience, the better our sector will work together on this stuff. So, Alex, all for it. Looking forward to seeing you coming in here for a while at some point.
Well, it was also for staff joining, new staff joining teams as well. It's very likely that we'll be standing up new policy teams in RA, and staff quite, reasonably want to understand what's the expectation. And other than learning on the job and, doing a bit of hand holding, it's quite hard to say, these are the things you need to do good policy making. So I think if there's more materials, training, especially for new people coming in, to be complemented by, secondments and things like that, that'd be really valuable.
The other thing, of course, is like what I've talked about today is like a bit of a skim over, as I'm sure you can appreciate. A lot of the things that we've touched on, there's a whole deep dive conversation you could have about those. And now that I know how to find the policy professionals community practice, we should stay in regular contact and work those things through. It'd be good.
Right, thanks.
We have 2 more questions that I'm really keen to get through.
Great.
And then we will wrap up. So, Kate, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Hello, William. Thanks for a really great presentation, and it's really encouraging to have a Cabinet Office with this approach re-established.
Great.
I think I'm a bit biased because I did work under Faye Greiner and Carr in the Cabinet Office many years ago, but I do think there's an important role to play there. But I do know that sometimes there's a sentiment, and maybe it's a cultural piece, and you've probably in some ways touched on answering this in the answers to the other questions. But I think there's obviously the people online at the moment are all policy people and have a a pretty good appreciation of why we're trying to do what you do and what we try to do. But sometimes other people seem to be a bit resistant to what they see as someone over here that doesn't really understand what they're up against. So I think is there relationship building or a culture exercise that needs to occur beyond the policy community?
Between TCO and the other agencies.
Yes.
Yeah. No, look, Kate, I know exactly the risk that you're referring to, and look, that's a perennial risk for central agencies, and I'm sure Treasury talks a lot about how do they position themselves with agencies to build productive and positive relationships when there can sometimes be a perception that central agencies are coming here to tell you what to do and doing it with very little expertise in the stuff that you're actually experts in. Look, for me, it's a matter of us viewing ourselves as really facilitating the success of the government's agenda and the success of agencies in how they go about doing that. That's our role here. It's not to take over anybody's role or to tell people what to do. It's really about understanding how we can add value and be part of delivering good outcomes for the people of New South Wales, really. As long as we always stay focused that is our goal.
Yes, I think that's a really important message that sometimes people can lose sight of.
Unfortunately, yes. But Kate, we're working on it, and if you happy to keep receiving your feedback on how we're going on that.
Okay, and then good luck with it.
Thank you.
And we have one really hard question for the end, James. Would you like to come on and ask your question?
Thanks, Louisa. Thanks, William, for a great session. One hard one just for the end to wrap up the last 60 seconds, William. Wondering if you have any advice for balancing the need to serve the government of the day versus the role of an apolitical public service in the Westminster system. What are the challenges and traps for new players?
this is a massive question, James. I don't know if 60 seconds is going to do it, but it does bring to mind a piece that I saw in the Mandarin recently about good policy advising. If I can find the link to it, I'll send it around. But in there, they talk about things to watch out for when you're advising government. And there's types of advisors, they say, just to keep an eye and you're not becoming one of these. And, there's some pretty obvious ones. Like one is, the show off who is using their brief to show how much they know about the subject rather than actually hone in on the advice they need to give, etc. One is the blabbermouth who just kind of wants to tell the whole world all the stuff that they know about the thing. But one that they do advise watching out for is not being a lobbyist, not putting yourself in, taking a position that this is the right value outcome for this thing versus another. I think for us, we are here to serve the government of the day, and the government of the day has come in on a policy platform, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to give objective advice that analyzes all the options and the implications and trade-offs of those. Now, making our advice useful by being aware of the context, aware of the fact that this government has a particular position that they've told the community that they intend to prosecute, that can help us make sure we put our efforts, into the right priorities and the right things. But it doesn't mean that we should compromise providing frank advice about the consequences of different courses of action. And so it is a trade-off. But I think that framing of, testing yourself. Am I advocating for a particular view? Am I becoming a lobbyist for a particular position? That's a pretty good test to know whether or not you think you've strayed from the course of objective, frank and fearless advice.
Well done. I think that's a great cheat sheet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds entertaining, and also I think to keep that very level-headed view on providing the best possible advice to the government of the day is really critical. We have gone a little over, and apologies for that. I wanted to thank William for your time and frank advice to us today, and looking forward to working with the Cabinet Office and developing a constructive and effective relationship for the development of policy and policy skills in the public sector within New South Wales going forward.
Thanks, Louisa. I've really appreciated the opportunity to speak to this group, and I see Peter Ryan there, another great champion of good public policy in the sector. Great to see you on the call, Peter. What a great group this is. I'd be really keen to come back and spend some more time with the group on whatever you think you might find useful as we rebuild this kind of strong central policy function in government.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for our audience in your interest and enthusiasm in policy, and we'll catch you again soon. Bye.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.